I am Clara Vance, 27 years old, and the evening my mother mocked me directly, I ultimately realized that endless effort would never earn me a true place in her heart. I sat around my parents' dining table as they praised my twin sister's upcoming wedding like a royal coronation, discussing rare orchids, an exclusive estate, a custom dress, and a lavish getaway that defied logic for a household that constantly preached frugality to me. I allowed them to chatter until I posed the single inquiry that never should have silenced the room. What about my portion of the marriage savings? They glared at me as if I had disrupted a holy ritual. Then my mother settled back, smirked as if clarifying a basic fact to a toddler, and stated that diamonds and pebbles hold different values. My sister actually applauded that remark. Applauded. As if degrading me was the climax of a comedy routine they had all eagerly anticipated. I shed no tears. I voiced no protest. I refused to supply the outbursts they likely desired to label me hysterical and unappreciative. I simply rose, grabbed my keys, exited the residence, and navigated through the dark without accepting a single phone ring. By dawn, my screen appeared chaotic. 53 ignored rings from my mother, 20 from my sister, voice messages, texts, pleading, demanding I return before committing a massive error. I gazed at the display for an extended period before finally transmitting one reply. Why are you pleading with a pebble? But to comprehend why that singular reply plunged my entire household into chaos, you must recognize what they had extracted from me for decades. Once my sister and I grew mature enough to grasp family dynamics, I clearly perceived ours harbored a preference. We shared a birth date, but all resemblance stopped there. She possessed the sort of presence strangers gravitated toward instantly. She was boisterous, magnetic, and theatrical, in a manner that amused elders rather than concerning them. She understood how to enter a space, and commanded as though a crowd had gathered solely for her performance. I remained reserved. I preferred schedules, consistency, and understanding precisely how situations functioned. My mother labeled me rigid, as if it were a defect. My father deemed me stubborn whenever I questioned why boundaries shifted solely for my actions. My sibling escaped consequences because she was energetic. I received discipline for minor errors because I allegedly possessed superior judgment. That remained the narrative within our walls. She represented the child requiring gentleness. I became the one mandated to endure without any. During annual celebrations, she received the larger dessert because she craved the spotlight deeply. During educational functions, my mother skipped my scholastic awards, yet miraculously attended every single one of my sister's recitals, including the lackluster ones. Whenever extended family dropped by, they heard endless tales about how gorgeous and outgoing my sibling appeared. Then my mother would point toward me like a footnote and mention I possessed intelligence. That became the category they assigned me. Prematurely, functional, yet overlooked, competent, yet uncherished. As we matured, it grew increasingly apparent that my parents ceased attempting to conceal their bias. They purchased her garments because she valued aesthetics. They provided her additional allowances because she possessed a popularity to uphold. They permitted her to weep her way past discipline while declaring me overly detached whenever I declined to participate. I formerly believed if I accomplished plenty, if I acted perfectly, if I simplified their existence, ultimately they would view me exactly as they viewed her. Yet every victory I secured only appeared to annoy them further. Whenever I earned top marks academically, my mother claimed I made my sister feel inadequate. Whenever I secured a collegiate grant, my father demanded I cease behaving arrogantly. Whenever I labored on weekends to purchase my own computer, My mother labeled me greedy for refusing to share it constantly. 0 achievements were permitted to remain mine alone. If I prospered, I was self-centered. If I established limits, I was antagonistic. If I remained silent, they presumed I could tolerate additional disregard. The matrimonial savings account remained the sole element I foolishly considered equitable. Our elders initiated it during our adolescent years. It was intended to be divided evenly, an offering for 2 descendants, a logical asset for dual destinies remaining unwritten. I recall my grandmother gripping my palm and stating that regardless of future events, this asset would remain untouchable. I clung to those words for decades. I actually contributed to the balance independently once I began part-time employment during secondary education. It was not a massive sum initially, yet significant enough to me. Since every cent symbolized hours of labor, nobody compelled me to exert. I deposited funds believing, eventually, upon my own union, I might step into that chapter, knowing a fraction had been preserved for me as well. It appears foolish today, yet growing up partially cherished forces you to become masterful at constructing optimism from leftovers. You grasp the tiniest shred of justice and handle it like evidence that perhaps the narrative remains incomplete. That was my blunder. I assumed the financial reserve signified a singular aspect of my existence. My relatives could not restructure around my sibling. I lacked any awareness they were actively plotting to execute precisely that outcome. The simplest method to comprehend the contrast between my sister and me today stands clear. I constructed foundations. She simulated them. I navigated university via academic grants, apprenticeships, and roles that trained me to prevent chaotic itineraries from collapsing. I landed in high-end culinary management because I thrived under tension and excelled at neutralizing catastrophes before outsiders noticed a flaw. I understood legal agreements, supplier deadlines, payment structures, backup strategies, and precisely how much sentiment individuals tethered to a flawless gathering. I additionally recognized how much wealth individuals gladly incinerated merely to ensure acquaintances felt jealous for several hours. That aspect never fascinated me. I relocated to Austin post-graduation and forged an existence that felt logical to my mind. My residence lacked luxury, yet it provided tranquility. My occupation proved taxing, yet it remained authentic. I settled my accounts, honored my word, and discovered that consistency functioned as a privilege after surviving psychological turbulence. My sibling pursued the alternate route. She rebranded her identity twice a year based on whatever form of validation appeared simplest to harvest. She attempted amateur art curation, then travel vlogging, then digital endorsements, then party promoting, none surviving sufficiently to establish a legitimate profession. Yet since she appeared sophisticated and mastered the art of praise, my parents continuously pretended she hovered on the verge of massive success. Whenever she floundered, they repackaged it as untapped talent. Whenever I triumphed, they handled it like an emotional flaw. By that point, I felt accustomed to the treatment. What they remained unable to erode was the reality I had begun securing independently. I encountered Julian during a kitchen inspection after a blackout severed electricity amid a massive banquet. Every surrounding person was spiraling. He operated as a structural engineer assessing the historic hotel renovation, and while the clients melted down, he proved to be the sole individual calmer than myself. We eventually shared amusement within a shadowy corridor over backup lanterns and destroyed floor plans. He proved considerate without acting theatrical, generous without demanding recognition, and he paid attention in a manner that proved I never needed to shout above the chaos to be valued. We courted for 2 years before discussing matrimony genuinely, and upon doing so, it resembled absolutely nothing of the disorder I survived during childhood. We analyzed finances before floral arrangements. We debated attendee numbers before visual themes. We conversed about vital elements versus superficial details. We desired a gathering feeling private, refined, and deeply sincere. Zero grandiosity. Zero fabrication. Merely a space filled with individuals who genuinely cherished us. For the initial moment in my timeline, I envisioned a ceremony devoid of looming anxiety. Concurrently, my sister broadcasted her engagement to Preston Thorne, an investment banker possessing lavish preferences, refined etiquette, and the exact ancestral pedigree my mother pursued endlessly via exclusive memberships and calculated social alliances. Judging by my parents' reactions, one might assume my sibling recently wed into sovereign nobility. Instantly, every dialogue shifted toward locations, cuisines, tailoring, elite networks, and how this ceremony required absolute flawlessness to unlock future opportunities. That specific terminology lingered internally. Unlock opportunities for whom exactly? Truly not for the fiancé, nor actually for the partnership. It operated entirely for my parents, for their public facade, for the delusion they perpetually projected onto my sister, since she embodied the lifestyle they wished outsiders believed they possessed. My mother began phoning me frequently, not to check my well-being, but to extract my expertise regarding suppliers, agreements, and schedules. Would I endorse a decorator? Might I review a culinary contract quickly? Did I possess connections to secure a discounted tariff on the estate? My primary reflex should have dictated refusal, yet ingrained routines remained difficult to extinguish. A fraction of my spirit still desired to provide value, since utility always functioned as the nearest substitute for validation I ever received. Therefore, I addressed a handful of inquiries. I introduced them to a property manager I respected. I highlighted a detrimental paragraph within one document. I informed them regarding accurate market prices, assuming they desired excellence without suffering extortion. My mother expressed gratitude as though granting me permission to assist was a charitable act toward me. My sibling scarcely offered any appreciation whatsoever. She remained entirely occupied broadcasting images of botanical canopies and sparkling beverage pyramids to her audience, as though she engineered the entire production independently. Even presently, I convinced my mind it held no significance. I retained Julian. I held my independent destiny. I secured that financial reserve, or seemingly I assumed I did. I trusted that upon our scheduled moment, some remaining asset would bear my title. I had not fully comprehended that, to my relatives, my proficiency was never an attribute to respect. It functioned merely as an alternative reservoir to empty. The evening meal, where reality ultimately shattered, commenced identically to every previous domestic gathering inside my parents' residence. Excessive theatricality, overwhelming fabrication. My mother summoned me southward for what she labeled an intimate coordination feast preceding the final ceremonial sprint. I nearly declined attendance entirely. Yet Julian urged me to maintain diplomacy if possible. He never matured inside a bloodline resembling mine. Still, he grasped enough to recognize I perpetually grieved the supportive household I deeply craved, rather than the toxic one standing before me. Consequently, I commuted for the night, transporting a vintage beverage alongside the foolish optimism that perhaps tonight they might operate like respectable humans for a single feast. My sibling radiated in that strictly calculated manner she always projected, whenever assuring every gaze remained fixed upon her presence. My mother continuously produced folders and fabric samples and guest diagrams, as though orchestrating a political revolution rather than a matrimony. My father discussed finances in an obscurely arrogant tone, indicating he desired to project authority without conveying any actual substance. During the initial 30 minutes, I primarily observed silently. Following that, my mother began detailing a sudden elevation to the estate contract, additional botanicals, premium illumination, an extravagant attendee transit service nobody genuinely required. I posed the inquiry softly initially. I inquired how spending at such magnitude impacted the remainder of the joint financial reserve. My mother froze completely. My sibling stared directly at her porcelain dish. My father coughed quietly and grasped his beverage glass. I perceived reality instantly. I merely lacked awareness regarding the true severity. I questioned them again, quite bluntly this round, demanding to know the status of my allocated portion. My mother lowered her utensil and delivered a stare I endured my entire existence, the specific glare communicating I faced impending discipline for destroying her idealized manifestation of truth. She declared that my specific portion no longer existed, since the vast majority funded my siblings' upcoming union. She delivered the news nonchalantly, as though describing meteorological conditions. I gazed coldly at her. I questioned the location of the capital I personally deposited. She lifted her shoulders apathetically. She stated that everyone sacrifices for the bloodline eventually. Afterward, I presented the inquiry that provoked her sinister grin. I asked if they drained our elder's legacy alongside my personal wages to finance her without ever intending to inform me. She reclined against her seat, folded her limbs, and chuckled aloud. Not an anxious giggle, not a shameful snicker, a vicious cackle. She stated plainly that diamonds and pebbles hold drastically different values. She claimed my sibling was entering a society where optical prestige proved absolutely critical. That expenditure appeared logical to them. She noted that Julian and I planned a miniature, quaint gathering instead. She rationalized that we required zero equivalent financial assistance. For a fleeting moment, I legitimately lost all auditory perception of the space. It felt as though my physical form muted entirely from my core outward. Then my sibling applauded briskly, sounding piercing and arrogant, mentioning our mother sounded severe, yet remained factually accurate. I believe that specific fraction of time permanently froze an element within my soul, because throughout my entire past, I envisioned an emotional snap as an enormous theatrical detonation. I assumed if I ever endured excessive pressure, I would ultimately shriek. Conversely, I shifted into absolute stillness. I analyzed all three individuals and comprehended zero among them anticipated any retaliation. They awaited visible agony, perhaps weeping, perhaps a verbal clash they might manipulate into evidence proving I remained erratic and envious. What they completely failed to predict was my transition into tactical calculation. Thus, I elevated myself. My mother commanded me against acting theatrical. My father suggested we might debate the issue eventually. My sibling rotated her pupils and questioned whether I genuinely intended to destroy the atmosphere regarding currency. I collected my purse, my metal fobs, and my jacket. I voiced absolutely nothing. I marched outdoors, whilst my mother continuously shouted behind my back. The instant I entered my vehicle, I shed zero tears. I powered up my portable computer, because throughout their haste to construct an extravagant ceremony they lacked actual funds to cover, they exploited vastly more of my industry privileges than they comprehended. The property coordinator they secured had approved a provisional reservation exclusively due to my endorsement. The botanical architect had authorized a price reduction via an affiliate credential linked directly to my corporate web. A transit supplier merely postponed total billing because I promised this household would never humiliate my standing. I dispatched 3 electronic messages and executed dual phone connections before I even reversed off the pavement. Entirely businesslike, completely sterile. I notified the merchants that I immediately revoked all private and occupational backing regarding any outstanding leniency agreements linked to the Vance Thorn celebration. I specified that I held zero monetary liability regarding any remaining debts and mandated nobody utilize my identity or standing progressing onward. I requested nobody terminate a single service. I lacked the necessity to do so. I simply extracted the foundation they constructed their delusion atop. Subsequently, I navigated back toward Austin throughout the darkness, leaving my mobile device inverted beside my leg. Upon reaching my residence, I possessed 7 ignored rings. Approaching dawn, the count exceeded 70. 53 originating from my mother, 20 originating from my sibling, an avalanche of audio recordings shifting from fury toward terror within under 6 hours. The estate demanded instantaneous validation. The decorator halted material sourcing. Transit operations remained frozen pending cleared transactions. My sibling's cosmetic stylist overheard rumors regarding agreement complications and demanded immediate guarantees. For the initial instance ever, they avoided phoning merely to extract silent favors from my energy. They dialed constantly because everything they erected by trampling my back began violently trembling. I audited a single audio message from my mother where she appeared gasping and enraged and terrified simultaneously. She commanded Clara to return contact immediately while claiming I pushed boundaries excessively far. Next came an audio file from my sibling, piercing with terror, concealed beneath extreme arrogance. She demanded I cease punishing her and avoid destroying her celebrations simply because I harbored resentment. I analyzed the display for an extended duration before drafting my text response. I asked why they found themselves pleading with a worthless pebble. Afterward, I disabled my device entirely and ultimately achieved slumber. Upon awaking later that midday, I anticipated experiencing immense remorse. I underwent lifelong conditioning to absorb blame. My complete youth brainwashed me to assume denying assistance to abusive relatives remained somewhat more disgraceful than the initial cruelty they inflicted. Yet remorse completely bypassed my senses. Liberation arrived instead. Not exactly euphoria, nor vengeance mimicking the exaggerated fantasy individuals picture whenever hearing that specific term. It proved a profound, vaguely alien comfort, stemming from permanently grasping that I never needed to endlessly volunteer as the structure individuals incinerated whilst traversing across my spine. My device continued detonating with alerts upon reactivation. My mother transitioned heavily into a martyrdom phase. She texted asking how I dared inflict such damage upon my bloodline, considering everything they supposedly provided me. My father, having barely whispered previously, transmitted a single icy text blaming me for dismantling my sibling's joy purely through jealousy. My sibling rotated through every possible alter ego within one digital conversation. Initially enraged, next condescending, then begging, ultimately promising to inform everyone I attempted destroying her union, since witnessing her thrive sickened my heart. That final threat nearly forced me to chuckle. Individuals resembling my sister perpetually presume every external soul operates driven by the identical superficial starvation controlling them. It never dawned upon her brain that I harbored zero desire to steal her luminescence. I simply finished hauling the platform itself. I ignored every single incoming communication. I phoned Julian rather than responding. I confessed every detail, incorporating the exact metaphor my mother deployed. He remained silent for several moments, in a manner confirming he felt significantly more enraged than he wished me to perceive. Subsequently, he presented the sole inquiry holding any weight. He asked if I committed any unjust actions. I denied any wrongdoing. He advised me to let them manage the disaster. They actively manifested. That trait functioned as a primary reason I adored him deeply. He never mistook tranquility for submission. Throughout the subsequent week, I discovered via blended audio messages, shared contacts, and the breed of societal rumors moving exponentially quicker whenever wealthy folks face humiliation that the celebration avoided total destruction, yet suffered massive fractures. My parents sprinted frantically to maintain its pulse. My father dissolved segments of a portfolio he possessed zero logical justification accessing so rapidly. My mother secured loans from dual cousins she secretly despised. My siblings slashed specific ornamental bonuses, yet exclusively elements attendees might overlook in digital galleries. They retained the estate, albeit utilizing a downgraded tier. They preserved the gown, because obviously they refused to compromise there. They maintained the illusion of affluence, yet barely managed it. Backstage, the environment reportedly resembled terror, intertwined with accusations and plastic funds stretched toward maximum thresholds. Multiple invitees observed that suppliers appeared incredibly rigid. An acquaintance of my mother intercepted a dispute regarding unsettled invoices near the banquet threshold. A relative messaged me confirming my non-attendance functioned as the genuine focal conversation all evening. Evidently, crowds deemed it bizarre that a twin sibling skipped such a monumental ceremony and deemed it weirder that nobody managed to supply a consistent justification twice. Select guests heard I suffered a corporate crisis. Others learned I contracted an illness. Several individuals believed Julian and I recently separated permanently. My preferred fabrication claimed I grew excessively psychologically fragile to participate. That specific lie clearly carried my mother's distinct trademark. Regardless, the portraits my sister published subsequently appeared sufficiently polished, provided you ignored the chaos occurring beyond the lens's edge. She beamed as though securing victory. Preston smirked, resembling a buyer standing alongside a costly purchase. My mother appeared, thoroughly drained, beneath heavy cosmetic application. My father appeared visually aged beyond my recollection. The digital remarks overflowed with customary shallow adoration. Flawless union, storybook spouse, utterly captivated by this pairing. I viewed the imagery exactly once before never checking again. The most bizarre element remained my total lack of obsession regarding the ordeal. I anticipated fury remaining ignited, yet isolation completely altered the composition of my reality. My relatives constructed their realities focusing on aesthetics, and upon retreating backward, I clearly witnessed precisely how delicate their existence truly functioned. They required my presence far heavier than they could stomach confessing, not out of affection, rather because I functioned as the logical backbone sustaining a household obsessed with optical prestige. Lacking my support, they retained the ability to host gatherings. They merely proved incapable of executing them flawlessly. Julian and I advanced our personal arrangements, utilizing a silent approach that kept my mind incredibly grounded. We visited a riverfront sanctuary beyond Austin, sizing smaller than any estate my mother could ever endorse, and instantly recognized its perfection. It possessed ancient timber, gentle sunshine, and a horizon requiring zero external validation from strangers. We hired a neighborhood cook, rather than an elite gastronomy team. We trimmed our attendee roster strictly to souls who genuinely supported our actual daily existence. Every decision resonated like an adjustment, not merely for my marriage, but toward my complete comprehension of authentic rejoicing. It involved zero acting. It involved true observation. It avoided aiming to stun wealthy onlookers. It focused entirely on those carrying absolute loyalty. Simultaneously, the telephonic outreach from my relatives decelerated, not reflecting any pardons granted, rather because they remained occupied sustaining the hallucination, proving their perfection held steady. I recognize that specific period lacked longevity entirely. Financial deficit commands a method for amplifying reality intensely. Matrimony behaves identically whenever assembled atop facades rather than vulnerability. I lacked any need to pray for repercussions. I possessed sufficient industry experience to guarantee their eventual arrival. Roughly 90 days post-ceremony, the initial legitimate fracture reached my awareness, originating outside the domestic sphere. A former university peer, still navigating shared societal orbits with my sibling, texted me post-midnight, containing an inquiry. Appearing relaxed, yet holding heavy weight, she asked if Elena and Preston were experiencing turbulence. I questioned her reasoning. She revealed Elena kept publishing obscure philosophy regarding isolation and counterfeit affection, plus bystanders caught her weeping mid-meal whilst Preston abandoned the table prematurely. I logically ought to have experienced pity. Conversely, what washed over my mind was sheer validation, not stemming from malicious wishes regarding her union collapsing, rather because I identified the commercial exchange occurring since day one. Preston never developed genuine fondness for my sister. He actively procured her. She appeared refined enough for portraiture, desperate enough for molding, and vacuous enough to confuse public exhibition with deep adoration. My mother adored him since he arrived carrying immense prestige. My sibling cherished him since he supplied elite standing alongside tailored wardrobes, plus a surname unlocking exact gateways she desperately dreamed of crossing. Yet prestige rarely equals closeness. Being selected falls drastically short of being understood. Once the reception concluded and the theatricality ceased generating thrills, they remained stranded alongside one another, discovering an absolute void. Concurrently, my father's economic stability commenced disintegrating in a manner appearing highly poetic had it avoided being completely pitiful. He eternally boasted about operating as the most brilliant intellect locally concerning monetary accumulation. That arrogance partially fueled why the ceremonial extravagance escalated wildly. He genuinely assumed he might dodge logical consequences eventually, except eventualities surfaced vastly quicker than anticipated. Panic loans transformed into snowballing deficits. Snowballing deficits morphed into severe tension. Severe tension triggered massive blunders. A peer allegedly discovered he covertly acquired funds from professional networks to satisfy domestic debts, and although I lacked complete details, I absorbed enough verifying his corporate standing suffered terminal damage. My mother's gallery, which previously survived entirely upon neighborhood optics rather than genuine revenue, began defaulting on leases simultaneously. She liquidated stock drastically, falsely, claiming it represented a brilliant seasonal tactic. She abandoned a philanthropic board seat she loudly flaunted for a decade. Associates she previously hosted ceased phoning frequently once she lacked an extravagant dining space to display. My parents dedicated immense energy fabricating the illusion of security, leaving them clueless regarding survival, lacking an audience. That specific timeline birthed the digital notifications anew. They arrived via unlisted digits, via obscure cousins, via a former resident leaving a massive audio rant claiming bloodlines demand eternal loyalty unconditionally. My mother drafted a physical note and shipped it toward my corporate desk, bypassing my residence for my workplace. That singular boundary violation proved she continued lacking basic humility. Within those pages, she attempted endless variations of reality, excluding the factual one. She penned that event anxiety-caused remarks delivered using inappropriate cadences. She documented that relatives commit errors. She claimed that my sibling suffered terribly inside her matrimony and required backing from her genetic counterpart. She completely omitted referencing that she labeled me a worthless pebble. She carefully ignored confessing she hijacked capital explicitly allocated for my future. She entirely forgot writing. She merely perceived my worth upon my vanishing, carrying a massive financial penalty. I creased the parchment and tossed it directly into the trash. 7 days afterward, my sibling phoned, utilizing a restricted caller ID. I logically needed to ignore it, yet a fragment of my soul wished to process her vocal tone once existence ceased cheering her on. She skipped any pleasantries entirely. She admitted her and Preston suffered massive hurdles. She claimed wedlock proved infinitely tougher than she previously imagined. She noted he constantly flew, constantly labored, constantly raged, and recently commenced dropping insults regarding her shopping habits alongside our bloodline's crumbling status. Next, she shifted toward her authentic motive. She questioned whether I retained associates capable of rescuing my mother's gallery via an exclusive promotional collaboration. Perhaps an elite gathering designed to herd fresh, wealthy buyers inside. Upon my complete silence, she prodded deeper. She inquired whether Julian possessed connections to venture capitalists. I legitimately almost respected the sheer audacity. Even presently, trapped within her personal implosion, she merely perceived me as machinery, rejecting my humanity, ignoring her cruelties, testing if a wrench remained ignorant of its own metal strength. I issued a firm negative. She turned hostile instantly, blaming me for savoring this downfall, claiming I patiently prayed for their agony, merely to experience ultimate superiority. That precise second, I ultimately vocalized a fact, standing solid for decades. I lack any need for your pain to solidify my identity. I simply required revoking your jurisdiction over my self-worth entirely. She abruptly severed the connection. Shortly thereafter, a mutual associate reported my parents covertly plotted liquidating their estate to occupy a significantly reduced property. Publicly, they cited desiring minimized upkeep responsibilities. Privately, massive deficits were suffocating their lungs. The exact structure where I burned decades learning my sole purpose was adapting, surrendering, accommodating endlessly, transformed into merely another asset they failed to finance properly. Julian discovered me resting inside our cooking space the evening I absorbed that update, gazing into the void. He questioned my mental state softly. I confessed a total inability to label my emotions. Zero victory lived within my chest, merely an odd sorrow regarding the reality that humans will obliterate their entire existences purely to shield their egos. He settled adjacent to my chair and spoke a player brund alay, phrase I permanently memorized. He stated certain folks would gladly forfeit the universe before confessing guilt to the singular soul they brutalized the most heavily. He spoke utter truth. My bloodline avoided crumbling purely because I withdrew my presence. They shattered because every massive decision they executed functioned to uphold a massive hallucination. The delusion claiming optical shine held greater weight than moral integrity. The falsehood insisting heavy bias required zero toll. The fantasy promising the offspring who manually maintain the gears would perpetually linger close enough to suffer exploitation. By that juncture, I entirely ceased confusing their self-inflicted catastrophes with my personal burdens. I wasted extreme portions of my youth settling psychological interest on loans I never signed for. If destiny finally mandated they confront the disaster they engineered that never qualified as viciousness, that represented pure causality. The ultimate occasion they initiated contact occurred roughly 8 months following that disastrous supper. Approaching that date, Julian and I concluded virtually all preparations concerning our upcoming union. We secured our stationery, our catering, our melodies, and an attendee registry so meticulously curated that every identity present generated peace rather than forced duty. My daily routine grew incredibly anchored, causing the turbulence I escaped to resemble a foreign continent. Afterward, one twilight, precisely while departing my office, my device buzzed, indicating a visual transmission from an untracked caller. I heavily considered rejecting the prompt, yet intuition compelled me to connect. My mother's visage dominated the display initially, appearing substantially aged and gaunt compared to my memories. Her cosmetics vanished, her spine slouched in a manner entirely alien to my eyes. My father hovered beside her shoulder, appearing as if sheer arrogance ultimately morphed into an unbearable physical weight. And stationed behind them, perched atop a couch inside a dwelling distinctly foreign to their former estate, rested my sibling. Speechless. Zero immaculate styling. Zero superiority. Zero external validation fueling her core. For a fleeting span, complete silence reigned. Subsequently, my mother commenced weeping, authentic sobbing, completely divorced from the dramatic performances she previously generated outdoors while seeking public pity. She whispered Clara exactly how desperate humans articulate a title after exhausting every conceivable manipulation tactic. She confessed they committed catastrophic misjudgments. She admitted they forfeited the massive residence. She revealed Elena and Preston were splitting permanently and confirmed the legal uncoupling turned incredibly vicious. She acknowledged my father's occupational standing suffered ruin, leaving their survival drastically strained. Next, she uttered the phrasing, "I starved my entire childhood to absorb, yet currently found entirely useless." She stated they acted unjustly. I observed her face and deduced that remorse lacking clear ownership perpetually sounds deeply hollow. Thus I demanded an answer to the sole inquiry carrying weight. Unjust regarding what exact subject? She shut her eyelids momentarily, as if formulating the truth inflicted bodily agony. She declared they misjudged my soul completely, unjust regarding my inherent value, blind concerning the methods deployed to manage my childhood, foolish regarding prioritizing public optics above basic equity. My sibling continued refusing to face the digital lens. My father eventually vocalized claiming he ought to have halted the madness decades previously. He confessed he convinced his mind he fostered harmony, whereas truly he shielded the toxic daughter from reality, while slaughtering the innocent offspring to achieve that delusion. I trusted he felt genuine remorse, and somehow that realization deepened the tragedy, offering zero comfort, because clarity arriving severely delayed fails completely to resurrect the decades it actively butchered. Afterward, my mother revealed the genuine purpose behind her transmission. She questioned if we might reboot our dynamic completely. She pleaded for my soul to summon enough grace to assist the bloodline's recovery. She avoided begging for currency, overtly, yet the underlying structure of her demand matched her historic patterns flawlessly. return immediately, anchor our chaos, guarantee our survival, requires zero effort. I analyzed all three faces and experienced an emotion I absolutely never predicted encountering during such a climax. Zero malice, zero triumphant spite. Absolute lucidity, the specific variety manifesting once deep mourning fully crystallizes into advanced enlightenment. I informed them my nuptials approached rapidly. I declared the gathering would remain intimate and serene and populated by souls who never forced me to labor for basic human respect. My mother commenced sobbing violently and begged if any probability existed permitting their attendance. My sibling ultimately lifted her gaze then, and for the initial moment across my existence, she appeared incredibly tiny. Not because destiny battered her into righteousness, but because the universe forcibly uninstalled the spectators she historically confused for actual devotion. I inhaled deeply and delivered the harsh reality they wasted decades sprinting away from. I stated they educated me perfectly regarding my status when they hijacked my assets, mocked me directly, and demanded I remain docile. I accepted your lesson entirely. I constructed my entire reality utilizing that specific curriculum. Currently, you must swallow that exact same poison. My mother breathed a desperate plea. My sibling parted her lips as if craving a debate, then sealed them shut. My father merely studied my eyes, possessing the expression of a debtor finally receiving the astronomical invoice for an account he ignored excessively. I promised I harbored zero desires, wishing them total destruction. I assured them I sincerely prayed they discovered proper social etiquette before desperately requiring favors from targets. I mentioned, hoping my sister eventually comprehended, that securing extreme bias never equals securing authentic affection, and that dodging logical repercussions guarantees a soul remains pathetic in every vital category. Next, I confirmed my permanent absence. I refused unsealing a gateway they strictly hammered against once survival grew torturous upon their territory. I terminated the digital connection before any rebuttals launched. 30 days later, I wed Julian adjacent to a tranquil river beneath strands of amber bulbs and ancient oaks, requiring zero artificial enhancement to radiate majesty. Zero circus elements existed. Zero counterfeit opulence. Zero frantic urges to paralyze wealthy crowds with envy. Merely sacred oaths. Genuine amusement. Humans arriving hours early, simply desiring to assist the setup, alongside the unshakable certainty that I finally escaped, lingering inside the darkened silhouette of another's theatrical production. While stepping toward Julian, I completely ignored whatever assets my toxic relatives successfully plundered. I focused entirely upon the core traits they utterly failed to detonate: my tranquility, my rationale, my capacity to cherish a soul without brutally degrading them beforehand. That specific victory, exceeding all others, represented the finale they absolutely never anticipated I might secure. Assuming a moral exists regarding this saga, it spans beyond karma, consistently looping backward, although it frequently strikes hard. It proves that deep parental bias venomously infects every single entity it brushes. It shatters the overlooked offspring, yet it simultaneously guts the idolized descendant by instructing them that genuine devotion equals endless spoiling, and that extreme worth originates from public peacocking rather than internal integrity. It trains elders to mistake heavy manipulation for protection and optical shine for triumph, until they suddenly awaken trapped amidst the devastating rubble of their personalized blunders. Furthermore, it forces the invisible child to absorb the most brutal truth imaginable, proving that profound recovery commences the precise second you cease pleading for basic justice from dictators who actively monetize your mute submission. Domestic circles ought to represent the primary academy where humans study self-respect, never the slaughterhouse where they surrender it. Affection lacking profound admiration operates as toxic counterfeit emotion. Pardoning crimes, lacking behavioral shifts, simply guarantees future abuse. Ultimately, shielding your serenity against invaders who magically perceive your value only when desperate for survival tools never qualifies as viciousness. It remains pure self-preservation.